Good afternoon, friends. Welcome. Buenas tardes. My name is Alfredo Artiles. I am honored to chair the session focusing on the 2024 Distinguished Contributions to Research and Education Award lecture. This is the premier acknowledgement of outstanding achievement and success in education research. Beyond the significant merits of this distinction, this session is very special to me, as the award recipient is mi hermana and colleague for the last 33 years. Chris and I started our careers in the academy at UCLA, and her friendship, support, mentoring, and advice all these years have meant so much to me. And as we know, her legacy of outstanding mentoring spans generations of scholars located around the world. And to a significant extent, we're better people and scholars because of Chris's presence in our lives. Let me now switch to a more formal introduction for the lecture. Chris Gutierrez is the Carol Liu Chair and Distinguished Professor at UC Berkeley. She's also a former Associate Dean at the Berkeley School of Education and Faculty Assistant to the Vice Chancellor for Research at Cal. Professor Gutierrez's expertise is in the learning sciences, literacy, and policy. She's also a methodologist with expertise in qualitative and design-based approaches to inquiry. Her research employs a critical approach to the learning sciences and to cultural historical activity theory, examining the cultural dimensions of learning in design learning environments, with attention to students and families from non-dominant and translingual communities. For example, her work on third spaces examines the affordances of syncretic approaches to literacy and learning, new media literacies, STEM learning, and the remediation of functional systems of learning. Her work in social design-based experiments, a new design methodology she developed to study and organize for equity and learning in complex real-world situations and people's everyday practices, foregrounds the historical, political, and ethical dimensions of design research and our theories of learning. Throughout her career, Dr. Gutierrez has grounded her research in long-term collaborative partnerships with educational and community organizations. Examples of long-standing collaborations with immigrant and migrant communities include Las Redes, a 15-year-long after-school program that privileged hybrid language practices for youth, grades K through 5th, El Pueblo Mágico, a STEM-oriented after-school program, and the UCLA Migrant Student Leadership Program for California youth from migrant farm worker backgrounds. I know a number of people in the room were involved in a lot of these projects. Gutierrez's research has been published widely on learning in premier academic journals and is a co-author of Learning and Expanding with Activity Theory. Dr. Gutierrez is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's a fellow of the British Academy, the International Society of Learning Sciences, and AERA. Professor Gutierrez was an Osher Fellow of the Exploratorium, as well as a resident fellow of Stanford's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. She serves on the Education Advisory Committee of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the International Society of Learning Sciences Executive Committee. Professor Gutierrez is past president of AERA and vice chair of the National Board for IES. Dr. Gutierrez has received numerous awards, too many to share here today. Let me share a few examples. She received the AERA Division C Sylvia Scribner Award for influencing the field of learning and instruction, the 2016 Oscar Caussy Award for influencing the field of literacy, the 2014 AERA Division Lifetime Achievement Award, and the 2014 Trueba Award for research leading to the transformation of social context of education from AERA Division G. She's also the recipient of the Spencer Foundation Mentorship Award and the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award. Her research has been funded by the Spencer Foundation, NSF, the Sloan Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation as co-PI on the MacArthur-funded Connected Learning Research Network and the UCLA Sloan Center for the Everyday Lives of Middle-Class Families. Please join me in celebrating Professor Chris Gutierrez.
Thank you. Oh, I don't need this up, huh? Thank you so much. Just in line with my title, this was all mutually constituted. As I'm looking out in the audience, there are so many of you who have profoundly influenced me. So it's appropriate title. Thank you, Alfredo, for that generous introduction. I am so glad this day is here. You have no idea. The good thing about getting an award is it's wonderful. But the bad thing is that then you have to sweat for a year preparing for this award lecture, right? Because you don't want someone to say, she got the award, right? So I'm so glad this is here. So first I want to begin with some thank yous. I had so many thought partners in this paper because I believe in sharing ugly drafts, Franken drafts, early on as I figure out my ideas. And there's just so many of you listed there that were so central to helping me think through this paper. And a huge shout out to the former 194 Las Redes and MSLI instructors who I hope I remembered. I know I forgot some people, but these people were central co-designers in everything I'm going to say today. And I just want to acknowledge their influence. My lifelong inspiration, of course, are my parents, Frank and Mary Gutierrez, who, if they were still with us, would be here. They never miss my talks. And to my wonderful son, Scott Perkins, who's here. And to his perfect partner and my friend, Anna Rose. Now, I do ugly slides, and there is this magical person named Jose Lizárraga who takes my ugly slides and turns them into something magical. So I have to acknowledge him. It used to say, fix your ugly slides, which it should say, because that's exactly what happens in his transformation. So a big shout out to Jose Lizárraga, Dr. Lizárraga, for his work. So here it goes. And I'm trying to time it so we have lots of time for conversation, but these are long talks, I want to warn you, so bear with me. So my interest in designing robust and nurturing learning environments in people's rich everyday practices, their learning and movement across microsystems of their life ecologies has only grown across the decades I've been in the profession. I knew empirically and from sustained interactions with people long after they were participants that these were transformative spaces with collective sensibilities and orientations. What sustained my interest is that in these these were design micro-contexts of development, small instantiations of possible futures for the many youth and graduate, postdoc, and early career scholars with whom I've had the privilege to work. My commitment to these efforts was initially motivated by my work with high school students and university students, minoritized youth who were tracked into remedial courses or provisionally admitted to the university and again placed in remedial tracks. Yet my close work with these students revealed extensive repertoires which could be leveraged and supported in learning contexts that I began to co-design. This work involved learning about students' history of involvement with schooling, including their access to meaningful disciplinary learning, to better understand their struggles with reading and writing and math, for example. Understanding their repertoires provided a better sense of what institutional and pedagogical arrangements would support their movement towards who they could become, and more insight into the processes, resources, and constraints that are often obscured when we try to analyze fragments of people and communities' lives to assess their learning and possibility. In many ways, I've been responding to the consequences of only understanding fragments of youth lives. What gets constituted and how matters to all youth, but it matters differentially to minoritized youth. I've worked hard to provide theoretical and methodological considerations to address the educational inequity that is exacerbated by narrow and deficit notions of youth learning, their cultural practices and possibilities, and especially the infrastructures that delimit life's possibilities. I hope you will begin to understand throughout this talk why focusing on people's routine everyday practices, people's dynamic movement, including the tools they use, the practices in which they engage, and the relationships and ethics within are fundamental to a kind of mutual constitution that creates a developmental ecology in which people and learning flourish. I hope to bring all these threads together to argue the importance of the developmental ecology and the sustainability of transformative co-designs. These are the big ideas that will animate this talk. My work, broadly speaking, has been concerned with re-mediating and imagining new systems and ecologies that are resilient, sustainable, and transformative. Ecologies, words I'm going to keep using over and over, ecologies that are designed for adaptability and variability. Design features important to the ecosystem's ability to absorb disturbances. Here, resilience and sustainability should be understood as verbs or gerunds, as Cindy Cruz often tells me. Resiliencing, yes, there is such a word, and sustaining are appropriate as they are always dynamic, ongoing projects, always being remade. Resiliencing and sustaining involve designing systems that are fundamentally oriented to support transformative forms of learning and human and ecological flourishing. Such systems mutually constitute particular kinds of ecologies in which learning is made consequential and life made precious. In educational contexts, these can become educational sanctuaries, to use Manuel Espinosa's term. I focus today on a particular kind of developmental ecology growing out of decades of social design-based work in which historicity, remediation, diversity, transformability, resilience, prolepsis, and sustainability are organizing principles. This development, see, this is cool, this is Jose. I had the idea, but this is Jose. This expansive developmental ecology was constituted by multi-sided educational systems, each spanning 15 years running simultaneously while I was at UCLA. The UCLA Las Redes, a K-5 fifth dimension after-school technology-mediated club, and the UCLA Migrant Student Leadership, or MSLI, a summer institute for high school students from migrant farm worker backgrounds. The first ecology included Education 194, a multifaceted course in the UCLA Education Minor that was a 3-course series that retained a core focus on learning and culture each quarter, but rotated its topic of emphasis to culture, gender, and technology, for example. The ethnographic component of the course involved undergraduates we called UGs, someone say UGs, involved the UGs traveling to our design fifth dimension, Las Redes, at Moffett, a large elementary school in an unincorporated area of Los Angeles near LAX, and a shout out to Principal Joanne Iskin, who remains our partner. The second system, MSLI, students moved similarly across a range of learning experiences. These designs were oriented toward educational possibilities, learning systems distinguished by a grammar of hope, possibility, and the development of historical actors who shared a collective vision of the world as it could be. After years of examining data, of listening to former students, staff, and instructors, refer to the transformational nature of these learning environments, it became evident that being in the spaces was consequential for its participants. Students' cognitive ethnographies and summative self-reflections evinced their transformation. I share several examples that overwhelmingly reflected students' experiences.
Learning should be considered a social practice. It is something that delivers healing and wholeness to both the students and to ourselves. Education also transforms us as well. I was healed and transformed during my time in this course and at Las Redes.
Oops, that's supposed to play.
For me, it is about valuing the significance of the small actions, the quiet moments, and the intentional questions that we do every day that lead to the teachable moments that create a space for social change that we all seek to have in the lives of our students, families, and friends.
As incredible as these spaces were for all of us, Leif's point that what is learned is always complex and complexly problematic remains instructive. Learning is always contested and hardly unproblematic, including in our ecology. Students, though, were encouraged to openly sense-make, leveraging their historicized experiences, social critical literacies, and course readings. As one undergraduate wrote about the new role of theory and his experience in Las Redes, my career through schooling can be characterized as a balancing act between bitter rebellion and a procurement of faith and progress. It is, as Bell Hooks describes, that I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. This ecology had robust sustainability and collective meaning. I was motivated to learn more about these processes and the dynamic formations in our developmental ecology, and to rethink how I might see these subsystems relationally, to understand their complexity, resilience, and sustainability. I think it's worthwhile to pause and address very briefly what ecology means in my work, as it is a central focus of my remarks. As I've previously written, I am very skeptical of and mindful of the debate about the limitations of existing theorizations of the concept of ecology, with its concentric circles and levels and scales. To review briefly, Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of the environment was concerned with how a person's development is influenced by the various interconnected systems and surrounding them. However, a focus on what influences development obscures the idea of mutual constitution, as well as how people, knowledge, practice, tools travel and get iterated across the ecology. Mutual constitution has not been central to this model of the developmental ecology, and this is one of the points I make today. So you might ask, why focus on mutual constitution? Well, it gets me closer to capturing complexity in learning activity and to recognizing that learning and development is a singular process. As my colleague and friend Barbara Rogoff recently wrote, individual and cultural contextual aspects of learning and development are mutually constituting aspects of a single process. Too often in our field, it has been easier to look at pieces of human activity and to ignore context or their relation. This is important as context, even here at this meeting, is still talked about and studied as a variable, as that which surrounds, to quote Mike Cole, a container of human activity. Context should be understood as mutually constitutive of people's practices and the participants and tools. Most analyses, however, do not address this point and focus on levels or discrete units or approaches that separate people from the social situation of development. My goal is to discuss why mutual constitution and understanding people across multiple activity systems helps us think in new ways about learning and development, about people's expansive possibilities, and why the constitution of developmental ecologies matters to sustainable and transformative innovations. Importantly, movement as part of learning processes has not been an analytical focus, an analytic demanding attention to everyday practices across the ecology. This commitment to capturing complexity is a conceptual, methodological, and profoundly political issue for me, as representing people and communities in their fullest capacities is consequential. Seeking complexity is also a design principle, as I hope to show in the case of the developmental ecology presented today. These two systems had much in common. Because of my own theoretical and social commitments, as well as the preparation experiences of the graduate instructors, a Freudian pedagogical and a cultural historical approach to learning and development undergirded program co-designs and the shared ethic and commitment to educational dignity. But they were enacted in different but mutually informing ways across the two systems. For Espinosa, Vusugi, and colleagues, education dignity is a multifaceted sense of a person's value generated via substantive, intra- and interpersonal learning experiences that recognize and cultivate one's mind, humanity, and potential. Espinosa describes educational dignity as a social verb. Indeed, these learning spaces were animated and sustained by social verbs that served as metaphors for the social life of the programs. Social verbs like social dreaming in MSLI involved a process of collecting and visioning of a more just future, a vision where youth were free to move beyond the constraints of everyday life to become historical actors, designers of their own futures. In these two parallel learning spaces, undergraduate and high school students and their instructors engaged in complex learning in which joy and seriousness, playfulness, and world building were tools to unschool and unlearn, where humanization and transformation and intellectual rigor lived side by side. These were all the words and characterizations made by former instructors. Intergenerational and heterogeneous configurations around joint learning activity and the playful imagination brought these learning systems to life. But this was not happenstance, as co-design aspects involved saturating the environment with a rich set of tools that mediated the dynamic choreography of learning in these hybrid, multidimensional spaces, all oriented toward the expansive possibilities of youth, educators, and communities. But importantly, while I'm arguing that 194 Las Redas and MSLI constituted the larger and more expansive developmental ecology, each was the developmental ecology itself, as each was designed for transformative learning that necessarily involved ongoing movement in and out of range of nodes or microsystems, as you see here, opportunities for participants to rise to the concrete and then ground their learning historically and locally, and to reflect and iterate their understandings. In this figure, you will note that each system was constituted by a number of smaller activity systems or nodes through which people, tools, practices, and knowledge move recursively and dynamically. People's participation in movement, looping in and across the microsystems, I argue, contributed to the ecology's transformation and resilience, as their movement across the nodes supported new forms of learning and teaching which flourished in that movement. We noted that the more recursive movement there was within and across the microsystems, the greater the connections between theory, practice, and deeper learning, and deeper understanding of learning as dignity conferring and consequential, mediated by tools we had introduced into the system. Movement in these communities involved participants learning across multiple sites and across practices that connected and deepened what they were learning in that movement. The programs in the ecology involve movement from a UCLA classroom to an innovative after-school site, and movement from a UCLA classroom housed in a summer institute to the grassy areas where Teatro del Oprimido, or Theater of the Oppressed, came to life, or to gender and comprehension circles in residential halls high above the campus. The latter were apprenticeships and walking with dignity. I had the opportunity to have a focused conversation, a reunion of sorts with a number of the program's former instructors from both UCLA programs, as many participated in both. They recall learning as ecological and relational processes, something constituted through joyful experimentation, love, critical engagement. In both ecologies, intellectual engagement was consequential and relational, with spaces for students to think expansively and collectively without foul, as one instructor expressed. Their words made it clear that these spaces were crucibles for imagining and enacting transformative learning for both students and the self across the lifespan, as one former instructor recalled. Similarly, participating students voiced the impact of being in these ecologies.
Our group research paper explored the fluctuating instances of authority within these gaming interactions. Although I did not directly reference them, my constant partner at site, 9-year-old Samantha, demonstrated time and time again that the antidote to deficit thinking can be found when linking the child and teacher in a relationship wherein she or he is not the subject, but a partner.
Individually, these were expansive ecologies, but collectively, they created the most vibrant and far-reaching developmental ecology, as witnessed by the dynamic movement of people, practices, and tools and design principles traveling recursively across Las Redes and MSLI and long into the futures of the participants who had been part of these ecologies. This movement supported iteration and opportunities to reimagine what these educational sanctuaries could be. The developmental ecology was unbounded, with people, tools, and sensibilities mutually constituting their formation and resilience. So now I turn to theory, as it can provide some explanatory power, allowing us to lift off the ground to return anew. The analytical frames of mutual constitution and learning as movement help explain how these transformative ecologies sustained our innovations across decades. Ecologies, again, where people flourished in their learning individually and collectively. To help us understand these concepts further, I insert here one of my favorite examples, an embodied historical and cultural example of mutual constitution of a practice that has had enduring cultural resonance for members of a Catalonian community that dates back to the 18th century. Thanks to Bill Peño, who introduced me to this practice during one of my stays in Barcelona. This incredible cultural practice known as castell or castles evolved from a traditional folk dance. It involves intergenerational groups of people, casteller, building high human towers with their bodies. This vertical human tower is constructed by people ranging from the very young and small to older, larger individuals, with the heavier individuals forming the base layer and the lighter, younger, and more agile individuals forming the upper layers. A young child, often as young as 4 to 7 years old, crowns the tower with the hand up in signal of achievement.
Our group research papers.
Cuando tú te acercas a un castillo es como si te acercas a un corazón que está batiendo boom, boom, boom.
El castillo es algo que está vivo, ¿no? El castillo se mueve, tiene sus inercias y cuando tú estás ahí te mueves con él.
This practice holds deep cultural significance for the Catalonian community. The act of standing on top of one another's shoulders to form the castell was a feat of mutual constitution of this incredible human castle that was enabled through intergenerational apprenticeship, cultural pride, relationality, trust, skill, and new forms of solidarity. This, however, was not a singular act. Instead, as we see here, individual, cultural, and historical aspects constituting the singular process of constructing the castell. We see movement in its mutual constitution. Capturing the processes of mutual constitution from everyday practice to cultural events has been central to the work within the cultural historical tradition, among a number of us employing various approaches that resist dissecting or isolating people from the people around them, their tools and practices, and focus on people's participation in the practices they help construct. People like Mike Cold and Barbara Rogoff who've done long-term work with this, Carol Lee, Roy P., myself, a number of us have really tried to be part of this conversation. This shift in focus and in units of analysis from either the individual or the larger social context to an activity system allows an examination of the interrelationship between the individual and the cultural setting. By understanding that processes are mutually constituted, but understanding that processes are mutually constituted, while exceedingly important, is in and of itself not the whole story. The goal of co-designing learning in ecologies that are dignity conferring and that support expansive transformative learning requires attention to the question, what gets constituted, how, and to what ends? And here's my second major point. Movement is rarely figured into this process, and yet it's an important dimension of mutual constitution. How do we better capture the dynamic nature of constitutive process, and how do we help ensure ecologically valid accounts of people's learning in and across everyday practices? In my work, attention to learning that occurs in people's movement, what I've called learning as movement, or LAM, has been a key analytic in SDBE's utopian methodological approaches. LAM's ecological perspective compels us to understand more fully the niche that constitutes people's everyday lives and the cognitive and social activity that is imbued in those practices. This theoretical orientation to learning and development organizes both my design work and its study around the principle that people are always part of multiple activity settings in coordination with others and their learning. I believe these two analytical frames, LAM and mutual constitution, are laminated. Thus, we need to think about mutual constitution as a dynamic process involving ongoing back and forth movement of people, tools, and practices across time, space, and history, capturing both horizontal and vertical forms of learning. I call attention here to the active movement of mutual constitution, which, as a cultural process, both enables and constrains. This point helps us understand that processes of mutual constitution of learning are not straightforward, unproblematic, and uncontested. It is necessarily relational, but it also experiences tensions and contradictions within and among systems and must be continually negotiated. This point raises methodological considerations, as capturing the learning in people's movement demands shifts in our questions and methods of inquiry to push on narrow claims about people's learning based on observations that do not account for the fuller range of people's practices and their participation in social interactions. The following brief clip of Tokyo's Shibuya Crossing, for me, captures how I envision the dynamic, multidimensional nature of people's individual and collective movement across the ecologies of everyday life. Imagine here people moving back and forth through this metaphorical ecology, carrying their cultural backpacks, their repertoires or tools and practices, repurposing them, iterating individually or with others in that movement. As a researcher of human activity and ethnographer of movement, I necessarily hold a methodological commitment to a multi-sided or multi-system approach, work that I've done with Shuri Musugi. Ethnographers of movement commit to collaborating in future-oriented design work with a sustained focus on the unfolding and developmental nature of the social life of people developed across the ecology. The central analytic here is on what takes hold and what is made consequential in people's movement, and how people's lives get reorganized, with attention to the myriad facets of infrastructure that make visible what Ed Soja termed geographies of consequentiality. The UCLA Las Redes and the UCLA MSLI mutually constitute a geography of consequentiality. Across this landscape, cultural, ecological, disciplinary, and other forms of diversity, in the fuller ecological sense, became indispensable resources, as diversity plays an essential role in transformability, resilience, and sustainability. Without diversity, the ecology and its inhabitants will not thrive or flourish. Resilience is put at risk. Notably, the kind of resilience employed here is ecological, including larger social cultural systems. But in contrast to individual notions of resilience, Ecological resilience in this work refers to the system's ability to adapt, to shape, to change and transform while sustaining the social welfare, resources, and social futures of its participants. Having said this, I also join interdisciplinary scholars in troubling notions of resilience and sustainability. Appreciation to my colleague Justin Hosby, an amazing scholar in city and regional planning at Berkeley, who introduced me to new literature relevant to this issue, sensibilities which resonated with my argument here. I agree with scholars McKinnon and Derrickson, who note that when the ecological notions of resilience and sustainability travel from the field of ecology and are then adapted to the social sphere, there is often a resulting implicit, if not explicit, maintenance, if not celebration, of the status quo. To resist this default, I draw on ecological resilience work and cultural historical approaches to utopian methodology for this very reason, to counter normative outcomes. Ecological resilience in my work necessarily involves transformations in conceptions of resilience and sustainability, which in my work are neither fixed nor sustain the status quo. Thus, their endpoints are understood, or should be understood, as moving horizons of possibility toward collective flourishing. Given the dynamic and dramatic social, political, cultural, civic, and environmental shifts and upheavals in the ecologies that are currently under threat, we need generative analytical frames. I know we need a lot more than frames. We need generative analytical frames to design educational infrastructures with long-term transformability and sustainability. Analytical tools that help us illuminate conceptual and empirical responses to questions such as, what social ecological formations are necessary for the developmental ecologies to persist? What kinds of relationships between individuals, communities, regions, and the environment and the economy support these formations? To paraphrase the questions critical geographer Kate Derrickson has posed. Thus, I continue to push on notions of ecology and seek approaches that help us avoid the tendency to separate individuals and practices from one another and the activities in which they participate and help to co-construct. These have been central frames for me in understanding the workings and the iterative designs of the developmental ecologies with which I've been involved. The notion of developmental niche, I think, is closer to how I envision some aspects and affordances of the developmental ecologies I have designed and documented. As defined by Super and Harkness, it involves the cultural regulation of the microenvironment of the child. Within this tradition, Tom Weisner's work on ecocultural niche and its emphasis on everyday activities and practices in the context of the cultural learning of a community has provided a generative frame for me in studying well-being and sustainability as dynamic. I have to insert, Tom Weisner was my colleague, but he was also my professor as a postdoc, who introduced me to ecocultural niche theory and daily routines. So shout out to Tom. As Weisner notes, sustainability is an ongoing project, not a one-time endpoint. It is contextual, embedded in an everyday routine of life, and this part of some social context. Sustainability includes both the local resources and ecology of the family and community, and the goals, values, and meanings that the community affords and people bring to their practices. Following Weisner, and of relevance to the analytical frames that I highlight today, we view resilience and sustainability as dynamic, iterative, and open processes. We've also focused on daily routines across our studies with youth, educators, and families, as understanding people's everyday lives is essential to learn what matters to them, to document the development of repertoires of practice, to learn how tools and practices are mutually constituted and travel across people, time, and space. I view these daily routines as micro-contexts of development, which become laminated in the mutually constitutive role with the larger cultural context. These micro-contexts also provide opportunity to understand how participants organize themselves and others and leverage resources that support individual and collective learning. The focus on everyday routines has been key to how and where we see mutual constitution across our work, from the Fifth Dimensions in Los Angeles and Boulder to MSLI, to our studies with families and more. These have been instrumental. However, we first used this straightforward daily routine matrix. It's one of the simplest but most generative tools I think I've ever used. We first used this in our UCLA study of the everyday lives of middle-class families, directed by Ellie Oakes, and subsequently in our MacArthur Connected Learning study of the new media practices of Latinx families. These daily routine calendars are completed by every member of the family and form the basis of interviews and observations and analysis of how their routine should be considered ecologically. I should note that our analysis did not, though, take a narrow approach to ecology, as we were always interested in analysis of political economy as issues of power, social structures, resource distribution, etc., were important to understand and highlight inequities. Daily routine interviews and observations were key to both, as we also learned about families, social networks, economic, social, and educational resources and constraints. Capturing families' everyday practices was so important to the multi-sided ethnography on the ingenuity of Latinx families' new media practices, in which we documented the joint activity between 60 and 75 youth and undergraduates and graduate students participating in our STEM-oriented after-school Fifth Dimension Club, El Pueblo Mágico, and a subset of 14 of these youth and their families. As part of this SCBE, we work with these families to jointly document families' everyday practices and their use of new media across a range of settings and activities. We spent a minimum of 8 hours in the homes of 14 families from low-income communities, the majority of whom were a heterogeneous group of Latinx families, and collected an extensive data set. We learned about families' practices while interacting with them and while documenting and understanding family and individuals' daily routines and their beliefs and practices around health, new media, social networks, education, and even energy use. Cognitive ethnographies following Hutchins, which are fine-grained, focused ethnographic detailing of the learning and interaction between the UGs and the children, were elaborated for each site visit by the undergraduates working and learning with the children in El Pueblo Mágico. These and video recordings of the home in El Pueblo Mágico and other jointly produced artifacts help us understand that what was learned in children's movement helped us learn what was learned in children's movement across settings, from the after-school activities to their homes and back. And I have to say, getting this MacArthur grant was just kind of a dream, because I always wanted to follow people and learn with them across the spaces of everyday life. We focused on how families organized daily routine and how horizontal or everyday expertise was leveraged in the new media practices of families. And in the course of doing so, we noticed novel and creative ways families took up and repurposed new media tools around immigration and safety and consumer. Capturing everyday routines, how people and tools were configured and moved across family spaces and peoples, was an essential part of our work. Here you see the depiction of how this focus helped us understand how knowledge and tools are distributed and ingenuity imbued in families' practices. We could see who was with whom and with which tools and how they were configured. Interestingly, people, ideas, and tools travel recursively, not in linear fashion. But as Mike Cole has helped me understand, their uptake is patterned and not random. But their ingenuity extended beyond new media practices. We also documented the rich ways they lived socially. Ingenuity became an important theoretical focus. We exemplified this theoretical point in one salient example of the everyday ingenuity observed in our participating families. We describe how one of the mothers, Katie, transformed commonplace resources and constraints into opportunities within the daily routine to support her children's learning. A divorced parent to 3 young children, Katie, a self-employed massage therapist, made the decision to undertake a twice daily commute between the house she still shared with her ex in one town and the children's school and daycare in another small town, in order to provide her children with stable routines and access to support programs available at their current school, including our after-school program in which her children were enrolled. As part of the joint activity of families' everyday practices, Katie created the morning routine video that all of our participating families recorded. One video captured the hour before they all left together for school, daycare, and work, and the other captured the family's 17-mile commute from their home to where the children went to school in a nearby town. While this daily routine could be overlooked as simply mundane, Katie's everyday ingenuity restructured this mundane commute and repurposed it in ways that mattered most for her family, leveraging and negotiating the resources and constraints of the local ecology.
We also use this time if we have to drive back. We do homework sometimes that can be read out loud, and we can try to problem solve things out loud. Just make the kids practice reading it to me and help them with the answers. Since the traffic's really slow too, it's like this on the way home. We could pretty much get some writing done too.
These were fascinating videos. While these daily routines and family repertoires provided important insight, it was more important to understand quotidian activities are incubators, crucibles for future activity, playgrounds for the future. It is this proleptic orientation in part that in part oriented participants across the ecology to engage in newly imagined projections and designs of our futures as individuals and collectives. In the smaller and larger developmental ecologies, learning was organized as a formative anticipation of a possible future, to quote Shadeen. There was movement across the ecologies, different kinds of movement that supported this proleptic trajectory. We designed for students, indeed all participants, to have the opportunity to lift off the ground to return anew. That is, to learn to use theory and analysis for their explanatory power as a way to unlearn and newly imagine, but always returning to the ground, situating understandings in the material lives of people in the ecology, only to lift up again using newly developed social analytical tools designed to return again to everyday life. So you have this movement. Students and instructors moved across different configurations of people and tools, across digital and physical spaces, genres, theories, and modes of learning and analysis, all designed for reflection and social analysis, historicizing, and iteration toward meaningful and respectful learning. For example, the UCLA UGs in 194, who were immersed in cultural historical theories of learning and development and a range of powerful social theories, ongoing reflection and dialogue, situated their understanding as they worked in joint activity with K-5 children around gaming activity. The children themselves were learning as they moved within intergenerational configurations with their amigas and amigos across a range of mediated gaming activities, including dialogue with the mischievous, mythical wizard we called El Maga. But our Maga is a benevolent entity. I'm getting close to it here. Across the years, the undergraduate students detailed how they leveraged the theories of the class and modeled the rich pedagogy of their instructional team in their collaborative play with youth. However, one of the richest zones of learning resulted from carpooling that facilitated the UGS trek down the very crowded 405 freeway in Los Angeles, one of the busiest freeways in the country. The UGs often detail their lively carpool conversations and their CEs about their readings, their youth, the discussions about youth and games and class discussions as they inch through the traffic. This mobile learning car became a site for what Mira Garcia Morel called carpool pedagogies, involving joint problem solving, distributed expertise, and reflection. You're stuck on the 405 for 2 hours, right? Going back and forth. Urban sociology and urban planning research have shown how city streets and freeways can create and maintain segregation. Ironically, in this case, the 405 freeway also helped to link UCLA students and elementary school students at Las Redes to a neighborhood with which they were very unfamiliar. The 405 also served as a conduit to deep learning for myself and the graduate students with whom we work. You can see it traveling all the way down the map here. As we traveled in a university van from UCLA to the Laboratory for Comparative Human Cognition, weekly to learn with Mike Cole and Urya Ingstrom, Olga Vasquez, and many others. Once again, the long trek down the 405 to UCSD transformed the van into another mobile learning vehicle as we made sense of discussions at the lab. Now, I know this is a serious talk, but you cannot have lived most of your life on the west side of LA and been most of your life on the 405 and not think about that classic SNL skit about the 405.
Just get out of here! Get on the 405 until you can't take it anymore.
The Californians.
Sorry, I had to include it because this is our experience if you've lived in Los Angeles. Probably the most consequential movement involved the instructional team, who moved across nodes, participating at Las Redes, engaging students' learning via the detailed cognitive ethnographies. Although initially comprised of me, graduate students, and undergraduate TAs who had taken the course, the graduate instructors and undergraduate TAs really assumed course instruction for most of this time. The activity of the instructional team itself became another site of deep learning. At the same time, the graduate students were immersed in the study of cultural historical approaches to learning and development through coursework with me and Mike Cole, and in ethnographic and qualitative approaches to inquiry with me and Fred Erickson. These were consequential. While all the graduate students brought rich histories of teaching and expertise, they were equipped now with the additional theoretical and methodological tools that were central to La Salle's experience in MSLI. And probably most consequential in the development of this larger ecology, a significant number of the 194 graduate instructors assumed leadership roles in the Migrant Institute, leveraging their deep knowledge and learning pedagogy, their deep knowledge of learning and pedagogy and social theories and disciplinary knowledge in the design of the various microactivity systems of MSLI. MSLI involved a different kind of movement where every space and place across the UCLA campus became a site of pedagogical imagination and a rich example of how particular kinds of movements are central to its constitution. In closing, Ray McDermott and Roy P. wrote about mutual constitution and movement in their wonderful chapter in the Handbook of Cultural Foundations of Learning. They said, life is an endless cycle of doing and figuring in interaction. It is not a credit to mainstream theories of learning that barely acknowledge this mutually constituted feature of people's learning. Context is not a simple variable to be manipulated. Context is not an experimental condition. Contexts do not stand still. They are continually made and remade. In this ecology, people were doing and figuring all the time, making and remaking. Its movement allowed the ecology to be continually reimagined in ways that made youth free to move beyond the constraints of their lives as learners, to become historical actors towards a collective vision of a more just future through the processes of social dreaming. I end with my favorite example of this embodied movement in which students are encouraged to fly through the university with their minds, to fly as historical actors as they socially dream for a just future for their communities, indeed, all communities.
Jesus, if you want to fight, you know you're going to fight? No, but you don't want to fall either. Okay? Right? He does not get hurt. All right, so, Superman, find a way. Right? He said, ¿cómo? He said, how? That's the question. Es la pregunta. How? Exactly. How do we fly? How do we socially dream? Help! fly if you're gonna fly. This is the only time your body's gonna be 3 feet off the ground like that. Here. Social dreaming is hard.
This is what has sustained me in my work. And with that, I thank all of you in the audience and in the profession who continue your commitment to creating and sustaining educational sanctuaries, particularly in this very difficult time. And I particularly thank all of you in the room who are actually part of these environments, because you can see your role and your inspiration in all that I said. Thank you, colleagues.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you, Jim.
I don't think this is on. There you go. Thank you, Chris, for that beautifully crafted overview of your research program and a reminder of how you've enriched our understandings of learning. We have good time for a conversation, about 30 minutes or so. So we have a mic here on the front. Please come and share your comments or views. Try to be brief so we can give space for as many of you as possible. Who would like to get us started?
Including people who participate in these spaces who I think could add things or refute.
I'm pretty good at wait time, so.
No thoughts, comments, questions? You know, I had a lot of detail on the history of ideas, but I made it an unbearably long talk. So there is an opportunity to talk about the history of ideas that I think would be really important. Hopefully, when I publish this, I'll be able to talk about those more interesting.
Yeah.
Such as the history of developmental niche came from Bea Whiting, who, just as she's coming up, was actually Barbara's advisor, and also Tom Weisner, who I refer, and so then I got to learn from Tom Weisner. So there's a real history of ideas. So I think it's really important in our work to acknowledge those histories.
Yes, genealogy of ideas is critical for all of us to keep in mind. Barbara, please.
I got up just because I figured it was part of my duty as Chris's buddy to get the conversation going.
No question to stump me, Barbara.
I won't reveal some of the past. The thing that I have learned the most from you, Chris, is about the idea of navigation. But the idea of navigation that Jose so beautifully put on the screen is like just the movement. And what I'm thinking I learned from you is not so much just movement, but from here to there. Like movement from home to school. As you learn, you change your repertoires from home to school, or from school to home, or whatever. And so I wondered if you would elaborate a little bit about how you mean navigation or movement now.
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I don't think, if you look at much of the work that people have looked at, people across the practices of their everyday life. They haven't, right? And instead, we circumscribe our analysis into one. So I think it's navigation is part of it, but that for me, that movement is really about capturing that, where they're going, moving across the space, and what they're doing in those spaces, how it gets configured, and then how it gets iterated. We were able to, in our study, to see how tools, activities that people had done in the after-school setting would bring them back to home, be reconfigured, and move back into the school in different ways. And so it's that rearticulation, it's that recursiveness that I think that is most important, is most often missing. So you have to do both. You have to look at where people are going, what they're doing, tools, practices, but it's always reconfigured in that movement, right? If we're thinking about movement as straightforward, we're missing it. It's always reconfigured. So how does it get reconfigured and why does that matter?
So it's both the movement between place A and place B and the process of getting there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Something related to this idea of movement, Chris, that I've heard in some contexts and discussions is the point of whether movement is only physical in the literal sense,
Yeah.
or if movement also something social and emotional. If you think about prolepsis, there is movement there.
That's right.
In time, in history, emotionally. Can you talk to that?
No, I'm so glad you said that because if you look at the design principles, if you think of it as just people moving, I mean, ideas are traveling, right? So if you think about tools, you're not thinking of just material tools, you're thinking about ideas and beliefs, right? Artifacts. And so that's what travel, it's much a larger configuration. I think that's why artifacts is really a useful concept. So we try to look at it analytically as ensemble so that it forces us to think about always with people in a space with tools and practices that are shaped and configured and traveled,
Right.
I think is more robust. But yes, prolepsis is really important to that. Right. And Daniela, who's been part of these projects.
Go for
Hey,
it.
Profe, good job. Nice talk. I have always been encouraged as a grad student of yours to think about the ways in which we can shift our methods to capture learning as movement, and thinking a lot about the simple, even the daily routine stuff that we used to do.
Right.
I wonder if you could help us now in this moment in time as a room socially dream about what grad students, professors can be doing in the moment to continue to do this type of work. I know that's a big question.
Wow.
Yeah, sorry.
That's a collective answer, but such a good question. And what I was trying to get at the very end, the truth is, and we're not publicizing this, right? No, is that the design work that I've done and some of the people with whom I've worked, including you, I always got grants that had money, but I didn't get millions of dollars. I wanted to transform institutions, different kinds, so that these things that we were doing became institutionalized in ways that they were embedded in the schools, at UCLA, right, in different spaces. And that's one way that we were not beholden to the canceling of grants that's happening now. And the kind of thing we were because we didn't have all that money, although we had some, but more importantly, the project was about transformation. And if you think of your work as just transforming this project, it's going to still stay as a little island. We were always interested in transforming both sides. So if we were in a school, what was the transformation in the university? Et cetera. And so thinking about it in that way meant we had to think in new ways about doing our work in the institution in which these things were embedded. And that's one of the reasons they lasted 15 years. And they would have lasted longer, except I left UCLA, right? This institutionalization was part of and I didn't get to talk about it in terms of sustainability. We don't pay attention a lot, Dana, to sustainability when we do our design, right? I come from a little tiny mining town that was so robust when I was growing up. But like the Rust Belt towns in the Midwest, nobody prepared for what happens when the mines collapse. And then there's huge poverty and unemployment. We have to think about those questions right now. How can we design this work and create new infrastructures that anticipate the shocks that we're going through today? And I think that blueprint has to be a part of our work. We can't just do our work in different ways. And I think that takes a collective vision. A lot of us are trying to do this work collectively. What's the blueprint for a new infrastructure for R&D now in the face of an environment that is trying to destroy everything we do, right? So we don't want to just get back to where we are. We have to imagine these new infrastructures, right? And what they mean for sustainability and for flourishing, most importantly. We just don't want to rebuild. We want to rebuild where people really do flourish.
Thank you.
Does that even get to what you were asking?
It does.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
it does. It was great.
Hi. It also gets to, it sort of answers the question I've been struggling with about sustainability. I love this concept about ecological sustainability, and I want to thank you for making me take Tom Weiser's class 30 years ago when I was your student, so thank you. Several long-term projects that I've been a part of in Rochester. One is a high school, as you know this, transformed, deep transformation, culture change, absolute change, ended in one board vote. So I've been struggling with how do we sustain the really rich ecology that was created that meets all of these things. Boom, right? Now what I'm finding as I'm continuing my work there is that change, that transformation that was made is, as a participant said, is unshakable.
Yeah.
But what would you say would be, like, how do we, when there's a hard stop, like, so we're moving and somebody built a wall. Ideas for, like, how do you get around the wall?
Gosh, Joanne, of course I don't have a perfect answer, but if you go back to that wonderful ecology map that I kept showing over and over, the ecology was not dependent on one node, right? And so you had the university, you had the after school, you had the 405, you had a range of kind of nodes in this ecology that together help sustain. I think that's really important to think about in design, because if we just, I mean, the opportunity for the students to really to learn and unlearn as you're moving across these spaces is just invaluable. And I think you have to design for that. You have to, now we didn't design for the 405, but wow, did it become a cool learning site, right? So I think that's one of the things that we can learn is that it evolves a system. And what are these microsystems that can help sustain, incite, and engage people?
Please.
Hi, Dr. Gutierrez. My name is Caleb Germanero. I'm at University of Illinois, Chicago. And my student demographic is under attack in a lot of different ways. We have a number of Arab students, a number of families of students who are of mixed status and things like that. So I'm thinking about, like, the learning and movement around campus and the safety of that with ICE and the university being a target, and how design-wise we could, and maybe this is another collective question of, like, thinking about, like, I'm teaching a place and land class in this next spring, and I'm like, how do I make sure that my students are safe if we're going out to different sites and things like that, right? Where classes are private, but if we're going out and doing this kind of learning and movement kind of work, how do we protect our students too? And how to design in such a way that makes sure that that's like number one priority, so.
Sounds like you're doing it. Do you want to tell us how you do it?
I mean, I guess that's why I'm here, because I know a lot of the folks here that I've learned from in learning sciences and stuff like that, that's like been kind of part of the way, right? But I mean, like, for us there, it's also trying to find community partners who are interested in that kind of work too, and trying to go to those sites where they have those protections in place. But I guess it's, yeah, kind of like collective kind of power here and knowledge and stuff, so.
Oh, gosh, I don't know. I think there has to be so many moments for reflection built in. One of the things we were talking about at dinner recently is how do we also not become orthodox in what we're doing in these spaces. We really wanted to create spaces that were really provided opportunities for everyone to kind of make sense of their experiences. And so we just saturated the environment with tons of those things. But I think you're asking a different question about, in this political time, how do we engage this work and be true to the principles in which we believe in designing, and yet not put our students at risk, right?
Hello, Dr. Gutierrez. I had a question regarding something that I've been really grappling with that I'd really love to hear your thoughts on. So my work has to do with community colleges and college access. And within the context of California, we see a lot of policies advocating for, we want to reach out to student populations that are very under-resourced, typically marginalized from higher education and such. And because of that, there's a lot of grants out there that community colleges can apply for, and community colleges can take that money and try to continue creating new innovations or programs in theory. But I think as I've been working at some particular sites, what continuously comes up is the difficulty with having everything being funded by grant funding. And so to what you were talking about, creating sustainable ecologies where these new repertoires are made, it feels like resources, particularly money, is often in some ways a good interruption or disruption, but then in some ways, because there is a time limit to that, it then introduces more interruptions that gets in the way of creating those new ways of learning and such. And so it seems that a lot of people pose the problem with how everything is funded by grants, but I don't really know how to respond to what an alternative would be. Like, what are your thoughts about the relationship that resources has with these ecologies?
Well, as I said, I mean, there are different kinds of resources, and yes, money is essential to some of it, but I think the more fundamental was the human resources that we had. I think developing a community of people that were so committed, so prepared, so to this kind of work, those were the kinds of resources that mattered most to the sustainability of our community. How do you create a community that continues as an apprenticeship for people to do this different kind of work, that it becomes part of a habit of mind and habit of practice? That's, to me, more fundamental than getting the grant. And in doing that, you can start to change the institutional practices around it. That's where I put my money, not on just spending all my life getting grants, but really on the human resources and the infrastructures that we can develop that really sustain that. But you need a community to do that. It is. And you need a community that is meaningful enough to people that they want to stay in it. I mean, the people who participated, all the people in this room, the instructors and undergraduates who stayed into these things for years, it's because it was consequential for them. It wasn't just graduate study, right? It addressed the so what, why am I doing this? And that's how you get people to really be part of these communities and to help you transform. But you also have to be open not to just be the leader. If you're not good at sharing this, and it's a learning process, then it won't be sustained. It truly is collective effort.
A quick footnote to that, Chris, is the case of ethnic studies in California and how we moved from developing, crafting knowledge about it to influencing the political arena over time. It didn't take a year or 6 months. So it's another way of thinking about knowledge mobilization, to really have an intentional approach to interfacing with the political infrastructures and structures to influence and have more stable funding, for example, as a way of resiliency.
And to the colleague who asked about student safety, I'm still thinking about it so much because one of the ways I know is, that's why I love Manuel's concept of educational sanctuary, is because you really can create, I knew somebody would call me in the middle of my talk, because you really can create these spaces where, at least in these spaces, these ecologies, I feel pretty confident that our students felt safe because the instructors felt safe, because we tried to create an ecology where people inhabited-centered, people-centered, in which people felt safe. That was key, yes.
The microphone is too high.
Is that Krista?
It is I.
Oh, Krista.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this beautiful overview of your work. And I think what I appreciate most is your willingness to revisit some of your ideas and trouble them, right? And so this idea of troubling resiliency and thinking about how maybe resiliency isn't always the answer sometimes. So I wondered if you could expand or think aloud with us about times when it may be necessary not to be resilient. Maybe we let things decay because they no longer serve us. And what that might look like in the context of learning ecologies.
That's such a beautiful way of saying it, and I'm going to follow you up so you can help me. I think when we are talking about, and Krista, I don't like this. The term doesn't capture it, so we're going to think about it. But fundamentally, when we were thinking about re-mediation, it was about not fixing things or people. It was about a real transformation, which would involve letting go. Letting go of those things that are constraints, that are threats to resilience, right? So I think that idea probably has to be lifted up more in this, but I think fundamentally that notion was trying to get at that, is that it's not, that's why I said that what I'm learning so much from this other literature is that we can inadvertently maintain the status quo in our work. And what is it, what do we have to do so that we don't sustain the status quo? That's not the kind of resilience we're talking about. We're not talking about durability, right? We're talking about a different kind of dynamic resilience. So I don't have the words yet, but your idea fits it perfectly.
Did you want to add or address anything, Chris, that you were thinking as you went through the slides in these last few minutes? Oh, we have another question.
Miwa has a question.
Yes. And
Oh, doesn't work. Thank you so much, Chris, for the beautiful talk. And thinking about the learning ecology paper that you wrote, what I really appreciated was your articulation with the relationship with your mother and the father. So thinking about that, how does this notion of intergenerationality helps when you think about this version of resiliency and the resilient ecology that you are articulating?
So how does my family, my mom, come into this? That's a great question, because one of the most meaningful things for me was to write about my hometown, because it was at once a horrendous, racist, but also a health hazard, very hazardous kind of environment medically. But it was such a joyous space too. And so had I had time, I was actually going to do that part in my talk and go back to my town like I did in my presidential address, because it was such an example of what I'm talking about, how the everyday kinds of practices like that my mother would have used would always have been in both in opposition to, but also in a creation mode about a way of living that was just joyous, right? And healthy and everything. So that town just, I want to go back and write that second piece, because I think it's really true. Because but that's why I look at people's everyday practices, because you don't see it. I come from a mining family. You wouldn't see these practices as other than mundane if you didn't know. But if you were using a different historical lens, you'd see that my grandfather, who was profoundly engaged in civic education, because he taught constitutional classes, citizenship classes in his living room, right? So that's why I keep emphasizing everyday practices, because I think that's the only way we're really going to understand both what people do and what matters to them, and how to help support what they want to do and what they value. So yeah, I could give a list of the wonderful things my mother would do, who never stood back to challenging and resisting. What a model. But we have to have that conversation, Mia. Oh, you guys have been so good at staying here. If I had money, I'd buy you all lunch, but I don't.
looks like Barbara's coming back.
Barbara's back. Okay, Barbara. Who's before Barbara?
Well, that last question, the first question, was one I just made up to get things started. But what I've been thinking about...
So mischievous, Barbara.
Now it's mischief. What I've been thinking about is, this is sort of a Lifetime Achievement Award, and people often treat those like your life is about over. And
I feel like it.
And I know that it's not. So part of my first idea about how I was going to ask the question was, so what's next? And then the second part was off of that last question. Because, and I think, Chris, you might know where I'm going here. It says, Chris has a book in her. And it's a book that I have been nagging her about for, 20 years more, about what you know about resilience or about life from that little town and life in that little town, and how people who it looked like the circumstances would be just devastating, and in some ways they were, and in other ways they had this strength and ways of doing things that are a model for what we can be thinking of now. So partly this is a nag, and partly this is an opening for you to say a little bit more about that.
Well, in the 2 minutes I have left, if I had more time, fortunately for you, I didn't. But I really did want to talk about two things in my hometown that I think were so important about the mutual constitution of the kind of life that my family and families like them created. And one was that the school system in our hometown, this little mining town, was actually designed by, oh my God, it just went blank, from Stanford, Terman. So who was all about intelligence testing and tracking. It was all based on your intelligence. Everything was on IQ. And his student, Tupper, was our superintendent when my mother was going to school in the town. And they designed the whole environment, educational environment, around that notion about IQ. So they had a school for the Mexican, now these are all US born, but nevertheless, for the Mexican kids and the Native American students. But you could actually be in the white schools if you looked whiter. It was definitely kind of comedic if you think about it. And these schools were organized around the so-called IQ. And so they create the school that my mother went to was deemed a vocational school because these pobrecitos could not do more than vocational work. And they learned so quickly how smart these students were, including my mother, and that they had to change the whole curriculum. But there's a whole history there of how this inequity gets made in these educational institutions. And there's so much more about being a company town. But I wanted to focus, and I'll say it in a minute, so where did the few Black families that lived in our town, where did they go? They had a one-room school in our town where they were further segregated and had to experience so much more than even the students in William Plaza, where my mother is. I wanted to focus on that, talk about an ecological resilience and sustainability. That school was amazing, but they kept trying to attack it. And so they got the two Black teachers who taught there. They brought suits against them and charged something that was horrible, which was not true. And so they had to leave the school. But interestingly, those teachers in the 1950s fought back and won a civil rights suit against them and were reinstated. And one of those teachers, Miss Bryant, was not only my mother's teacher, they stayed for a long time, she was my penmanship teacher. And Miss Bryant was, first of all, this stunning, perfectly dressed, well-dressed, I paid attention to that, all the things in there, but she was just a wonderful role model. She was our penmanship teacher. But the story of how the ecology was really created to be at odds with the Mexican school and the Black school, and yet how these institutions were transformed by the people in them and the communities around them, I think is a story worth telling. Huh, Barbara? Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll keep nudging you about the book, Chris. So good reminder, Barbara. Thank you. What a treat to celebrate the Distinguished Contributions to Research and Education Award by celebrating Chris's legacy. So join me again in thanking Chris for her contribution.
Thank you.